Hmm.
But I feel it's safe to say that currently, for the time being at least, English is the modern lingua franca for various reasons: military, economic, cultural, so on and so forth. Your input?
Yeah, I agree. English is definitely the number one right now because of the internet, because various languages have become the lingua franca throughout history, Latin being one for a time period, then it was Greek, then it was French. The upper levels of like European society used to all speak that as like the common tongue. But the thing is none of them were widespread beyond their region. Whereas English, it seems like is set to just become like the default human language, especially because the internet is like the space in which everyone operates in.
Yeah, since it was created and developed, and it's still mainly operated out of the United States, which has an English dominant language, looks to be that for a little while as well.
Right. And I know like it at least I've seen this opinion a lot within like linguist circles and whatnot that, no language is necessarily better or worse than any other language. But there are certain languages that are more suited to international usage. Chinese is something that I think about wherein it has a lot of speakers. I think it's one of the most spoken languages, but it is a poor lingua franca because one, all the speakers are concentrated in China, and it's only seldom used in places like Singapore, very rarely used outside of the mainland. And also the way that it's expressed through characters and symbols, it's very difficult to adapt to other languages, and very hard to translate it over to computers. Because I know other languages that use different alphabets like Korean Hangul, Arabic script, or Russian Cyrillic, they have difficulty uh, expressing foreign words, but they can still do it. Whereas Chinese is rigid characters and symbols. So the best they can do is use characters and symbols that already exist and try to make an approximation of what a name would sound like. And that's just like one example. Pinyin, another like version of the Chinese language that doesn't use like the traditional characters, is used online a lot just because like up until very recently, it was very hard to basically convert the Chinese language into like computers and stuff, just because like every sound and every word has like its own character.
Yeah, I remember reading a news article not too long ago actually, and how there's an issue with modern Chinese students. The issue is writing Chinese characters because of their well, because they mainly use keyboard keyboards to type, and that loses a fair bit of the Chinese language. And also feel that China is the Chinese language. I guess Mandarin is the main variation of Chinese is not destined to be lingua franca for a moment because China has there's a lot of interest in keeping China isolated um, from outside influence.
As in the Chinese government
Yeah,
is interested in keeping, yeah, so I know the Chinese government isn't the only one that does that. Uh, I I remember reading a few years back that the government of France used to have some sort of governing body that regulated the French language, and one of their main things was trying to avoid this encroachment of English words in the French language. So they would create like French versions of English words that had already like permeated the French language. Um, and that was their attempt to stop like the Anglicization of their language, which I think is important. I think languages should be protected. I'm not a big fan of like languages adopting English words, especially if there is already a word for that in the original language. And I know it's becoming a huge problem in almost all the languages I speak. Um, as you know, like Russian uses words like computer,
Uh,
or they'll even say like iti shopping instead of saying like to going to the shopping mall. Nepali, it's weird, but whenever I go to Nepal, people are always shocked by the words that I use because the Nepali that I learned is from my parents who grew up in the, 80s and 90s in Nepal. I've been isolated from that, and as a result, the language and words that I use are seen as almost archaic because they use the original Nepali words for it rather than the English language. Um, and it's a shame, I think, when you're speaking a language and then you have to think of a word in another language because you cannot find an equivalent substitute. So I don't know what the solution to that is. I think that's kind of inevitable, but I'm not opposed to some organization at least attempting to preserve the language, like the French government, or it sounds like even the Chinese government does.
yeah, I guess I'll clarify and say more in the fact of like the Great Chinese Firewall and such. Not
Right.
necessarily maintaining the it's it it does maintain the Chinese language and Chinese culture, but it's kind of more is it yeah just I was argue to excessive isolation.
Mm,
I know for a fact, yeah, again, like, yeah, a lot of different languages are adopting English words and phrases to describe certain things, which is not uncommon since the English language has a lot of words taken directly from German, French, such as it rendezvous, French grenadier. It's also French,
right.
but it's not completely alien for this kind of language evolution to happen. I mean, for English, I guess the go-to will be saying like Google. Google is now a phrase you use to, the noun you use to say to do an action, not just a company, but an actual word. So,
Yeah, I agree. And you know what's interesting too is when you speak about the Great Firewall, it's created an interesting effect wherein Chinese citizens are almost isolated from the rest of the world due to the firewall. And I like to think about it as in terms of evolution, wherein say a species can split off into unique subspecies due to geographic barriers. A mountain range comes up, a river comes in between, whatever happens, and then a species is separated. And due to the different pressures of the two environments, they start developing their own variations. Like maybe one becomes bluer and the other has bigger fins. What I'm trying to say is like the firewall is almost acting like a geographical barrier, in that Chinese citizens have develop their own internet culture that is so unique because they're isolated from the rest of the world. They have their own version of Wojaks. They have their own internet memes. They have their own inside jokes. And due to the nature of the firewall, they cannot speak on certain topics openly. So they've developed ways to communicate what they want to say, uh, such that they avoid the censors. And that's created like a super unique environment.
yeah, the Chinese internet is definitely a fully unique, environment that is
Mm.
to be seen if it's a positive or negative thing. But you know, since like English is kind of influencing a lot of languages, it's interesting kind of it's it's hard to really see, but it is interesting to think about the effects it's having on how people perceive and act differently now than they would have if their language is entirely their own. Uh, so, so I guess the sort of kind of small scale is just by using the internet, you are kind of opening yourself up to an American or English language uh, mentality. You have to kind of think in English. If you want to do like coding, if you want to do web development, Everything is, even if it the user facing side is in your native language, it's still rooted in English. And if you want to make like deep actual changes, you have to work in English, which
Hmm.
in ways is the question of um how does that change how you do things. So I think for you, like, do you notice any changes with people from Nepal? Like, you know, younger versus older generations, even though there is a myriad of differences between, other differences between, you know, people born before internet and people born after the internet. Do you see any differences that you could kind of point to that come from the use of the internet and intermixing of English languages?
Yes, I actually can speak on this directly. So I went to Nepal when I was a child, and then I went to Nepal very recently. And in terms of culture, I think my relatives and peers that were my age understood me a lot more because we all operate on the same internet. So on a shallow surface level, they knew all of the memes that I was referencing. They knew a lot of American slang, and they were very familiar with like my way of life just because they all use Instagram. They all use YouTube. So they're watching the same videos and listening to the same songs I am. And it's similar in Korea too, where if I meet a Korean and we don't speak the same language, we still have seen the same movies, listened to the same music, we know the same memes, and they're very familiar with like American culture. And one result of the internet I've noticed is when I was younger, whenever you would go to a foreign country and you would see the English language option, it used to always have like the British flag. But very recently, at least in Korea, 100%, if you click the English menu option, it always has the American flag. So I know that creates a lot of like distress for the British. But yeah, I think American, the American accent is now seen as the default rather than the English language being taught as like that is the proper English language.
Yeah,
And then you have the American variant.
British
To the
English
point,
versus American English.
right. So when you think of English, you think of the American accent to the point where I have a lot of English teacher friends here in Korea, and they actually the academic institutions actually select for American English speakers above others just because it's the easiest for Koreans to understand. So the permeation of the English language through the internet is like the biggest difference I've seen. I don't know. Have you had any similar experiences like that with your relatives or your experience?
For me, I don't have quite the yes, recent history to say, but I know for a fact that, yeah, in Russia, you know, American memes are prevalent. And what's interesting too is I kind of noticed is Russian YouTubers kind of follow American trends as well. Um, so using the same camera angle, using the same kind of thumbnails, even the way of speaking, is in Russian, is kind of
Hmm.
American in some instances. So
Hmm.
there's definitely influence, and um, again, like memes, jokes, you know, they have their own, of course, but there's also a lot of crossover. Uh, it's an interesting mix. It's sometimes hard to tell where the American influence ends and where it begins.
Yeah, one negative I will say is at least in a lot of countries that or at least in Nepal's case, it feels like everyday language is still Nepali is still used with heavy usage of the English language now, especially with the younger generation. But what's really worrying is higher level um institutions such as universities, science labs, business, journalism, whatever, that's usually all conducted in English. So, there might be the odd place that still uses Nepali, but again, and I'm not an expert just because I don't live there, but from what I've seen, when you get to the really high levels, a lot of courses and universities are taught purely in English. And a lot of like technology related jobs conducted purely in English, just because um, that is a level at which like native languages have hasn't reached yet, just because it's like new words come out for elements and whatnot, right? So there might be like native words for gold or silver or copper, but when it comes to like new elements that are discovered, they usually just get like the Latin variant, and then that just becomes like the only way to express it in any language. The
Oh,
only languages that resist this are Chinese, just because like the difficulty of the language almost acts as like a benefit, because English cannot be brought over very easily into Chinese language as it can in Korean and Japanese. Um, and that's almost like you can see the difference in where I live currently, Korea, whereas a lot of English is turned into Konglish, where they'll just say like the English word in a Korean, I guess, accent, and then they'll represent it using Korean characters. So ice cream is ice cream, but North Korea, which is obviously very against the West and resistant to foreign influence, still uses Korean words for the same thing. So instead of ice cream, they use orumbosungi. I can't pronounce that correctly, but
yeah.
in a weird way, I kind of appreciate how little their language has changed. And a part of that is just because they just don't share the same internet as us. So yeah, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of sad in a way that the only countries that kind of maintain their own language are those that are kind of up in opposition to America and American ideals.
Right.
Um, but yeah, it is in a way you could say that soft imperialism, a blending of everything into a single homogenous thing. I know in
Mhm,
Africa there was I forget I do not recall who made the video, but there was a like a short documentary in one of the
mhm,
African countries where they spoke a mix of English, French, and start speaking Russian because of the modern influence. So they
mhm,
would interchange different languages, just in sentences. So let's go start off English, switch to French, finish off with a word in Russian. And sometimes in some areas it'd be German or Portuguese, depending on on a colonial era influence and such. So
mhm,
it is the internet and English is kind of making a mess of languages everywhere.
mhm,
Um, and I guess the main thing that kind of uh, circle the square, I guess, is
yeah.
American ideals being kind of spread through the language and the memes from the internet.
I I see what you mean. Um, when you say that it's almost like countries that are opposed to the US resist the English language the most, whether they're politically isolated or in the case of in this certain case, I think geographically isolated. So something I learned very recently uh, is about the Persian language. So again, I don't speak Persian, so I'm not an expert on this. This is just something I read online. But whenever you think of the Persian language, Farsi, you think of Iran. That's where they speak the language. And it's also spoken in parts of like Afghanistan and whatnot. But the main source of Persian is Iran. But apparently, the most pure version of Persian uh, that is most that is the closest to the Persian that was spoken by a lot of like the famous Persian poets and singers and authors like Rumi, for example.
Mhm.
That version of Persian is actually closer to the Farsi that is spoken in, I believe, Tajikistan rather than Iran, because Tajikistan is far more isolated from Iran, culturally, politically, geographically. So now the most pure version of the Persian language is not even spoken in Persia or Iran today.
Yeah, I've heard similar things happening, and like mountain tribes would be speaking, like ancient dialects. In
Hmm.
some cases, it was I forget I forget what it was a while ago, but there was some like village or group of villages out in some mountain somewhere that had been fairly isolated for such a long period of time that they continue to speak, like the type of language from what was it like 1600s, 1700s kind of era, which to whatever language that was near unintelligible to who was speaking. I believe it was in the Central Asia in one of the stand countries, possibly Kazakhstan.
Mm,
This was back
right.
in like
I
the
know.
2010s. I remember reading it.
And you know what? I've always thought of language as the cornerstone of cultural identity. So when you think of like a culture and a people,
Yeah.
there are, obviously like foods, like, recipes and ingredients are a huge part of it. There's music, there's also like religion, customs, and all these ceremonies. But if there's one thing that binds a community together the most, I honestly believe it's language because it is the way that you communicate to other members of your community. It identifies you as a member, and from language flows literature, the rest of culture. Anytime you watch movies or listen to music, they're all done through that shared language. And if you lose that language, then you may still claim to be a member of that identity, but you lose out on, it feels like a huge chunk of it, like um, Native American tribes, I know they try really hard to maintain their culture, but a lot of the members can't actually speak the language itself, whether it's Sioux, Cherokee, whatever it may be, right? So um, they might do like a ceremony or some sort of like ritual a couple times a year to try and keep the culture together. They might have clothes that they might wear, but the thing is they don't do these things every day. They don't have ceremonies every day. They don't wear indigenous clothing every day. The food that they eat is probably not similar to what like the original like Sioux people ate for whatever reason, right? So language is the only thing that they would still use on a daily basis if they still had it. So because they don't have that language, culturally they're de facto almost like everyone else. They like Native American community members, they will eat normal food, wear normal clothing, and go to jobs like everyone else. And if they also speak, English is their default language, which the most of them do, then it's very hard to say they've like preserved that culture if the main cornerstone, which is language, is gone.
Yeah, you can't really believe in a god or believe in spirits if you have no word for them. You can't experience. You can't do a ceremony if you have no idea what it means.
Mhm.
Having a language is kind of what makes. I'd even argue what kind of makes people people in a way. Because yeah,
Right.
again, like imagine if there was no word for you know colors. Colors didn't have a word. How would you explain anything color in terms of colors? Like even if you could see it, even if everyone kind of knew what it was, if you had no words for what it was somehow, it would essentially be no different than if everything was black and white.
Yes, I see what you mean. So I know there have been a lot of attempts to bring back languages. And honestly, some of them have been quite successful. I know in Israel, Hebrew, or the modern interpretation of Hebrew had not been spoken for a millennia. And then there were like several strong programs that taught uh Israeli citizens the language to the point where now Hebrew is widely spoken. Same with, for example, I'll fall back to what I'm familiar with. Nepal, the official language is Nepali, but Nepali was just one of the languages that was spoken in the region, and it became the dominant language due to invasions from certain rulers and whatnot. But my clan or caste, you can even say, had its own language before Nepali replaced it all, called Newari. And my father speaks it, my father's side of the family speaks it, but because it comes from a Sino-Tibetan family tree, versus like a like Indus family that Nepali does, it's not mutually intelligible at all. There's no overlap between the two languages. I speak Nepali fluently. I understand not a word of Newari. That
Oh,
being said, Newari was close to being a dead language because not only would the people outside the US not really use it, people in Nepal would start to not use it as well just because of the prevalence of Nepali, which almost acted like English in that situation. But there have been a lot of programs to teach young people um, Newari to the point where I believe there's been a resurgence of the language recently. And we've seen this in a lot of other places as well. I know it's being actively done in Ukraine right now, where like the Ukrainian government is emphasizing the Ukrainian language and actively teaching it in places to they want to prioritize Ukrainian in Ukraine, obviously, above Russian.
and unfortunately, really, is just the small native groups that absolutely shafted. I mean, native tribes here in America, in Russia. There's dozens of ethnic groups also having issues, with the language. Um, yeah, in Nepal, everywhere, China too. I mean, Mandarin is the state language, which is imposing on uh, what's it being imposed over other dialects and variations.
Mm.
Uh, but I guess we can kind of swing the whole language thing, it's language and culture to kind of, I guess I would kind of say, slightly funny aspect of how everyone is subtly, subconsciously, or consciously copying America in a lot of ways. So I guess
Okay.
for us, we'd be kind of most familiar with adoption of multicam across different countries' militaries.
Yeah.
Um, Now it could be argued because multicam is a superior camouflage, but it could also be because it's the U.S. is using it. And if the U.S. is using it, then may as well, why not use someone else's? So why not copy it for your own?
Yeah, I think some of it is just like it's similar to convergent evolution. I don't know if I'm using that
Yeah,
term correctly, but it's when like different animals start developing the same characteristics because of similar pressures in their environment. Um, you know, so I think part of it is just it's a good camouflage. So I see why a lot of countries are adopting that camouflage just because it blends in really well with almost anything. I know a lot of
yeah,
people are upset about it because I think different countries used to have very unique camouflages, and now everything is just becoming a different shade of multicam. Is that sort of what you're leaning towards?
yeah. Kind of. Again, this is definitely getting to the speculative territory for me. But it's a question of, again, how much of it is this convergent evolution, or how much of it is copying, or how much of it is just subtle influence. I know it was in some like European countries, people who have kind of grown up using the internet have started
Mhm.
adopting like U.S. phrases for political stuff, such as like um, like the First Amendment, is the freedom of speech, the right pursuit of life and liberty. American ideals, while not expressed, word for word, but essentially mimicked in the mimicked for European purposes. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, so um I think part of it is just we are the dominant cultural influence right now, like soft power wise. It's our biggest export. The Rammstein song, like we're all living in America.
Yeah.
Um, and I kind of see it. I mean, I was touring the Korean War Museum down at the DMZ, and I got to look at a lot of the diagrams of like military engagements and whatnot. And the Korean schematics were all obviously in Korean, so I couldn't understand that part of it, but the symbology was exactly the same as ours. So in terms of like reading the military unit symbols, I understood them all. And then when I asked, there were some Korean military members, I asked them like, how is it that we use the same system? And their answer actually made sense now that I thought about it. But we worked, the U.S. military and the Korean military worked closely during the Korean War, so there was a need for the two sides to speak the same language. And then obviously, like with the US and Korea being such close allies, the Korean military has sort of like adopted US military practices and incorporated into their own. Not just because like it's better or whatnot, but also just you want to be able to speak the same language, right? So the way that they structure their military, the way that they do things, it, you know, I don't want to say copy paste because there are differences, but it is heavily modeled after our own systems.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because alien nations like Korea, Japan, England, even like France, Germany, Australia, definitely have influence from the U.S. military for that kind of stuff. But
Mhm.
that's the best way to describe it. But no, it is overstated and exaggeration and such. But different militaries and cultures do have different ways of approaching things. So like for yeah, like I guess the state up for American military is very independent, small unit, kind of gung ho, shoot first, that's for later kind of mentality. Overruling firepower and rapid aggressive actions. Nations like let's say Russia, is much more defensive, static, you know, emphasis on more of mass fires over and look at of course stereotypes and all that. China, mass waves of you know people and armor and vehicles in offensive actions. That's what a deal. Uh, so my kind of speculative question for today, I guess, is how much of modernization and future developments by other countries, not just for military, but for other things as well, is influenced just by the influence of the English language, of American culture, and American ideals. So again, of course, some things could be part of convergent evolution or just coincidence and such. But how much of it is influence from America? So like small unit tactics, is that just because it's the best way, or is it because it's the American way? Small unit tactics, certain doctrine, changes. Um,
Mhm.
even planning practices. How much of that is American influence, and will does that American influence actually affect foreign policy?
Oof, that's a deep question.
Yeah,
I'm not gonna BS you. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that 100%. I could provide my own theories, but in terms of the military, America is made fun of for a lot of things. We have really unhealthy people. We have a lot of problems with crime and all these different issues. But one thing that countries don't really ever question or make fun of is our military prowess. We are currently like the world hegemon right now, and that means like our military is the most ready in the world. It's been stress tested, and it's at the forefront. So it's only natural that a lot of countries seek to emulate the path that we're following, not just because of convergent evolution in the military or because the influence of the English language or American soft power. I think this is one of the few cases where, from what I've seen, we genuinely have the best of the best. It's not perfect. There's a lot of problems, but the thing is, if you compare our practices to utopia, it's never going to hold up because that's an unattainable ideal. If you compare our military with other militaries, there's no comparison at all. We are so far and ahead that we're in our own class, essentially. But what that means for us is we can't get too complacent. In that the Russian Ukrainian war has shown just how much warfare has changed. So, like, drones are obviously like the biggest difference, but there's also like a whole host of other things that we need to be adaptable for because militaries are really good at being ready for the last war. Think of in World War One, the soldiers on both sides were training for charges and whatnot, bayonet charges. And in World War Two, the French were perfectly prepared for the last war. So they were safe behind their Maginot Line right up until the Germans drove their panzer divisions through the forests and then flanked it all. And now today, I think we're perfectly prepared for the war of the 90s and 80s and the global war on terror, but we're unprepared for what's happening right now in eastern Ukraine, which is small unit tactics, use of electronic warfare, drones, um, the way that um, the way that drones are like integrated with every other aspect of the military, from artillery to reconnaissance to even logistics. I mean, drones are being used to like drop off supplies for frontline troops. We're just not ready for that just because like it is the nature of the military to be slow and bureaucratic.
Yeah, I guess the way to explain my thinking is, so you know, when you think PMC, right? Does start off. What do you think of when you hear the word PMC or mercenary group?
I mean, I think of the Wagner group just because they're
Yeah,
like the most prominent, and when I think of them, what comes to mind is essentially like professional cowboys. They're very unorthodox. They have a healthy disrespect for red tape and bureaucracy. And what that means is the bad side is they're very hard to control. They do things their own way and they're very decentralized. But the advantage is that they're very flexible. They're quicker to adopt new technologies and tactics than traditional army units. And that is that leads to a lot of innovation. Like I know the Wagner group brought a whole host of lessons for the general Russian ground forces just because I mean in the days of the Battle of Bakhmut, it was Wagner that was capturing like ground more than Russian army units
yeah,
because they were doing things like instead of waiting for the right way to do things, they just found the most effective way, whether it
yeah,
was communicating through radio, using certain equipment, or certain tactics. They just did a trial and error basis, and if something worked, they did it. And if it didn't work, they were quick to just drop it, and they didn't have to go through the bureaucratic processes to do so. That's what I think of.
yeah.
Why do you ask?
Well, because again, I don't think we'll ever just confirm, but I have a hunch that Wagner was heavily influenced by Blackwater, when they were operating back in Iraq and Afghanistan, during the global war on terror. Because Blackwater had a disproportionate, I'll say, impact on, was it culturally and mentally than they did kind of physically. Like Blackwater was very well known when they were operating, for what it did. for their logo. I could say it's kind of the main thing, their appearance, the style. And again, pure conjecture, but it does feel that Wagner has, from its initial, when it started, had influence from um, Blackwater, since Blackwater was essentially the biggest thing that biggest modern PMC with the most kind of capability before they got shut down due to all the various issues they had in the Middle East. So it again, it can
Anyways,
be argued in a not that roundabout way that an American PMC that itself was influenced by the American Army influenced a Russian PMC that then turned around to influence the Russian army 10, 20 years later, which is actually this thing is kind of like I'm thinking about the whole influence of not just American military, but American thinking, American language and all that on other nations. Since
right.
Wagner is, I think, this is very clearly a Russian entity at this point, and it has been for a while. But again, how much of his roots are based in American development? I guess how much of its
Right.
leadership, its structure is based off of American design, or I guess American, not necessarily American design, but based off American use, recent use, essentially.
Right. I mean, so a lot of this topic is sort of like, it's sort of like, yes, we are the number one dominant force right now. Like, it's all coming back to that. But I guess I do want to say, I think we have to be very careful because I feel like the conversation is turning into like, we are superior. Not necessarily,
Yeah,
but like,
yeah,
I think it is important to remember that like, you know we're very new to the scene. Like America has only been a hegemon for the sole superpower for like the last few decades, ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was one of two superpowers since World War II. And then before I'd say World War II, it was a power, but definitely not a superpower. Um, I think we have to be careful because while we are militarily strong and our soft power is strong right now, and economically we're still number one, we have to remember like I don't know if that makes us great. I love living in America and I love my country because of the values that we represent. And this is gonna sound very cliche, but like the freedoms that we have.
yeah,
We're not great because of our power, our economy, or soft power, because those things do not last. I mean, the Roman Empire was like the number one for how many hundreds or thousands of years? And not just the Roman Empire. I mean, the Aztec Empire dominated South America. You had the Han dynasties, the Song, the Qing, and whatnot. You had the Abbasid Empire, then you had the Mongolian Empire. Like, we are just the power right now, but I think we have to be very careful in thinking that that will even last because we've
yeah,
only been the power for what the last few decades.
yeah. I'll clarify that I fully agree. I mean, it's not. I want to say I don't know. Does they pass on as kind of chest beating? America first.
Right. Yeah.
America
Like
number one.
it's not
Like but I guess I'll say a better way of putting it is we can look back on history and point to was it Roman influence on neighboring nations, cultures, tribes, and such. French influence, on was it the musket era combat and warfare. We can go to dominant powers in the past and point to various instances where this is a clear influence of Rome, France, Mongolian, Chinese on this development. And yeah, I say yeah, that's a better way to put it. It's kind of try to see in the modern world what the American influences on other cultures in the same way that the French and Romans and so on and so forth, Greeks, Persians that had back in their time.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I will say, like, in terms of like looking ahead to like the future a little bit, like what will happen to us when we are maybe one day no longer the superpower, right?
Mhm.
I like to bring up like an interesting case. Um, in Central Asia. So in that situation, right, Central Asia was part of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had, as you know, like a lot of strong policies, like no state religion, Russification of like a lot of different cultures. Russian was the lingua franca. You know, it was pushed to learn Russian over like the native languages, whether they be Kyrgyz or Tajik or Ukrainian or Estonian. Those were sort of pushed out, right? Then you had the collapse. And then you had the independence of all these countries. And now they're doing like, obviously they're trying to like promote their own language, Estonian, Latvian, Ukrainian, whatever, instead of Russian. But I think one of the most interesting cases is Central Asia. So Kyrgyzstan, just because like I focused a lot on this country in like my studies and whatnot. I remember watching a really good Vice documentary on the practice of bride kidnapping in Kyrgyzstan and how it wasn't really prevalent during Soviet times, but ever since the breakup of the Soviet Union, the video that I watched sort of like talked about how the Kyrgyz were looking for a sense of identity and they turned towards from Russian culture and Russian language to sort of their Islamic roots and their nomadic roots. And one of the things was the practice of bride kidnapping, which, from as I understand it, it used to, started off from the day where you'd have like nomadic tribes. And if you wanted, your lover and you couldn't marry her during the normal way, you would sneak into the tribe, steal her on horseback and ride away into the sunset.
Yeah,
And the modern version of that is, at least the the good version of that is essentially like it's just highly ritualized cultural way of popping the question where it's not real kidnapping, it's almost like an act. So like both families are in on it. It's coordinated, it's planned out. You kidnap the bride, and then take her to the wedding, and then it's the responsibility of the families to like convince her to marry the groom, and then it's the job of like the groom's family to go to the bride's family to ask for forgiveness and then to invite them to the wedding. Um, and with that, there are a lot of problems because, you obviously can't have women kidnapped on the streets, even if it is pre-planned. Like police uh,
yeah,
units have no idea of whether it's real or whether it's just a thing. So that's sort of what like the documentary touched on. But that's just an interesting way of like once the hegemon in that area was no longer a hegemon, what happened to the countries that were once under the influence of that superpower. And the thing is they towards turn towards uh other aspects to reclaim their identity.
yeah, yeah. Again, it is interesting, interesting web of influence and everything.
Mm,
And yeah, I guess it's just recently been kind of thinking like like what is America's influence on the world? In
mhm.
the more subtle ways other than the obvious thing.
I think cultural, there are, so in Korea too, I think there's like some cultural diffusion from America as well, just because, I mean, just beyond, we've been, troops have been stationed in Korea since the Korean War. So America has had a huge influence on this country, and you can see it in their cuisine as well. Like one of the most famous dishes is budae which is like army stew. And it's essentially like traditional Korean soup, but it has like a lot of American ingredients like spam, sliced cheese, like the yellow like
Yeah,
sheep
yeah.
variant.
American,
Bean.
literal American cheese.
Yeah, so I mean, it's once you think about it, you know where it came from. It's all like army food.
Yeah,
So the history is that in the wake of the Korean War, there wasn't a lot of food. So the only rations that people got were from American troops. which in their meals they would have like canned beans, spam, American cheese, and whatnot. And then Korean people ate this out of necessity until it became a part of their culture. And now one of their most famous dishes is army stew,
Yeah.
budae-jjigae, which has like American ingredients in it. So, um, that's the influence I've seen. Culturally too, so this is gonna be a little interesting, but sometimes as someone who grew up in like a Nepali cultural background, sometimes it feels like Korean culture is actually closer to American culture than it is to typical Asian culture. And what I mean by that is like I've thought about this a lot, but in terms of uh priorities and whatnot, Nepali culture is very family oriented, where when you marry someone, for example, you're not just marrying two people, you're marrying two families. So when I went to a Nepali wedding for my cousin, it very much was that. I mean, you know, this is what I understood of the cultural process of getting married, but essentially like you finally like decide to marry someone, right? It's a very long process, but the wedding ceremony itself is you have a like party at the groom's house where you know you bless the house, you do rituals, you hang up lights and flowers and you prepare all the food, right? So once you prepare all the food, your family gets together with like a bunch of hired musicians and you create a convoy to the bride's house, right? So you carry all this food and you sort of like go in like this convoy that like walks for a bit, then hops on a bus, and then everyone goes to the bride's house and then you present all the food to the bride's family. You do a bunch of ceremonies and rituals there, and then symbolically, the groom takes the bride in his car, which maybe was like a horse back in the day or something, right? And then they drive back to the groom's house. Um, and there's a lot of like cool little like interesting cultural traditions. Like they have to like uh, hold hands and walk through the door of the house together for the first time, but the door is blocked by like a bunch of children who demand money for passage. So you have to keep paying like the children until they're happy enough to move aside. Then you enter the house, do a bunch of ceremonies, and like in Nepali culture, you're not supposed to share food because it's seen as like unhygienic. So symbolically, like you get like an egg and then the groom takes a bite of it and then symbolically you give it to like the bride and then she takes a bite out of the same egg and that's to signify that like now they're one entity, you know, so like now they're man and wife, like now they can do that. um and it's a very drawn out affair. My point is it's like it's a big deal, it involves both families, because it's very communal. I went to a Korean wedding, man, and I don't know if you know this, but they last like an hour tops. You will be so shocked if you go to them, but you essentially go, my experience is you show up, and immediately, it feels different. It feels less culturally significant. Just like in the attire alone, like this is not to say it's good or bad, but just my interpretation, right? The attire alone is business casual. So
Yeah.
you will see people in like just like a polo, maybe a suit, like the family will wear like a suit, but like people are good to show up in like business casual. I even saw a guy in a t-shirt. The wedding is very quick, like it's like 30 minutes of speeches, maybe a quick video, a small performance, but the wedding I went to was it was like about 45 minutes long and it was really amazing, really pleasant. Then you have dinner together in the venue. But then you're almost like ushered out because the venue is booked for like a certain time period. So it's like time for someone else and someone else and someone else. And then afterwards, there is no after party. You just go home. So, I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's just I was definitely culturally shocked. That was like the first time I actually felt cultural shock. Um, and I was just surprised because compared to a Nepali wedding where like it's like a 3 week affair, you wear like your best clothing, you wear the traditionals, like you wear like the Western modern suit, right? You have like
Mhm.
that, but then there are like parts where you wear like the traditional Nepali like wear, you put on all this makeup and all these different things. There's so much dancing and singing, and there's like three parties. There's like like gift giving, which is like a huge part of it. Whereas in the Korean one, you just sort of like hand cash. So the wedding felt very like Western, like almost more Western than the West, because
Yes.
American marriages are more involved than Korean marriages. So in a weird
Yeah.
way, like Korea felt more Western than the West, and in that
Yeah.
aspect, and very different from Nepali culture.
I see. Yeah, I think a kind of better way of explaining kind of my general idea for the stuff because like we kind of see how like leaders of different countries talk with each other now, right?
Right.
How will they talk when they've all been raised on the same memes, using the same terms, you know, use following the similar ideals and such, is my end question, when everyone
Right.
can say, this guy's a Wojak and everyone knows exactly what they mean as leaders of country, what,
I don't
you
think I
know,
would be able to take a world leader seriously if he started dropping words like Sigma or Riz or Wojax or,
yeah,
you know, he's going up
yeah,
on
yeah,
mic and like, ladies and gentlemen, don't worry, nothing ever happens.
but yeah, that's the thing. Like when everyone is more west than the West, when everyone is, in the know of the language and everything, everyone's been kind of raised culturally the same in a way because of,
Right.
English or again, it doesn't have to be English, it's just what it is now. How will it
Right.
be in the modern day and age? Because we have examples from, again, Romanization is, I guess I would say, the biggest example other than like Chinification.
Mm,
Of that kind of thing happening on a large scale, but it hasn't
right.
really been like global. So the question, I guess that is my, yeah, that is my big, speculative question of if America or English or whatever eventually becomes the main, you know, language and or has heavy influence on future leaders, how will that kind of change how things are? Because
Well, I'll tell you what it won't do. It will not lead to world peace and everyone holding hands and singing Kumbaya.
if
That will
anything, it might,
definitely not happen just because we speak the same language. Like,
if anything, might lead to the end of the world.
I will say
Hmm.
this. I just thought of this, but you know how we were talking about how like like this whole conversation has
Yeah,
been about how the English language is slowly taking over all other languages, right?
yeah,
I've seen that in clothing as well. So I first thought of it a few years back when I read an article about like suits and whatnot, and I haven't had a chance to really like I've been thinking more and more about it. And think about this. When you look at the United Nations, right? There are people from Lesotho, Burkina Faso, China,
yeah,
Iran, North Korea, Russia, America, Britain, France, whatever. What do they all wear? The same thing: suit, tie, blazer, shoes, a watch, and then conservative hair, which is like kind of honestly what I have,
yeah.
like
Don't forget the
professional.
tie. The tie.
Yeah. It's so frustrating to see that because they are from all different parts of the world. Why have they adopted a like a standard that has developed from I think Britain?
Yeah, it's
Uh
British
yeah, I think it came
origin.
from Britain, right? It's such a shame because like there are different countries that have beautiful attires, right?
Yeah.
Like you might be familiar with, because you're from, your family's from Russia, like the Cossack attire, like the traditional like
Cossack
saber,
or
whatnot.
Kazakh?
Kazakh.
Kazakh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
Like
yeah,
the
but
saber, like the overcoat, bright colors. You have traditional Chinese clothing, which I
mhm.
forget the name, like the wedding dress.
Yep.
Um, you have like the hanbok and whatnot from Korea. You have like the kimono from Japan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these world leaders, they just wear suits. And the only person I've seen really go up against this trend is Narendra Modi from India. He's the only world leader that I've noticed that consistently wears like traditional formal Indian attire instead of like a suit and tie. And I really
Yeah.
respect that.
Yeah. I mean, to kind of borrow the civilization joke, are people now wearing your jeans to listen to your pop music?
Yeah. I mean,
Cultural
look, there's
cultural
no going,
victory achieved.
yeah, there's no going back. Like world leaders are very concerned with their image. So no world leader is gonna wear like a traditional, like, indigenous, like how silly would Putin look if he wore like traditional Russian clothing to like a UN conference, right? Or whatever, right? So it's just not gonna happen. But I do think it is a shame because suits look good. I like them, but there's so much to the world than just suits. So I kind
Yeah.
of don't like how everyone's just become a copy and paste of that.
Yeah. And but again, let's kind of then type it to the whole thing of like, because everyone's in a suit, right? Everyone treats each other, kind of in a more equal fashion. You're all just the same. You all
Mhm.
appear the same. That definitely has a change in how you view the person across you. If everyone's wearing their own cultural clothing, I can guarantee you, uh, discussions would be different. Maybe not
Mhm.
drastically, probably not drastically, but it would be different. Like
Okay.
again, imagine, yeah, even like right now, imagine if you I mean, just talking to someone in a t-shirt and jeans is kind of different from talking to someone in like a different clothing. Again, like Nick, cultural clothing. You'll be like, why are you dressed in that way? Is something going on? Is there an event going on that I'm not aware of?
It's a shame because I have a lot of Korean friends after living here for a while, and I always ask like, do you own a hanbok or do you own like the like traditional clothing of like Korean culture? And they all look at me like I'm crazy. They're like, no, that's super old fashioned. I'd look ridiculous and I'd be made fun of by my friends. And I'm like, why?
Yeah,
Why would you be ashamed of that? Like, it
yeah,
might be funny if you show up to school in that, like, but to just own it, why is that a shame? Why should you be ashamed of that?
yeah,
Like, wear it for special occasions and whatnot. Like, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Um, and so I'll say something spicy. I maybe as like our final thing, and I'd love to hear your opinion of it. But I have been thinking a lot about dog food in Korea.
uh-huh.
The practice of eating dogs in Korea. So it is a thing. The Korean government has banned it recently, and there is like a grace period, but I believe by like next year or 2027, it's supposed to be officially banned. If you take a look at the polls in Korea, almost all young people are universally against it. Almost none of them have tried it. And even among older folk, where it is eaten more, it's rare and rare. The general consensus is horror if I bring it up. Like, no, I've never, I would never eat dog, whatnot. It's barbaric. That's sort of like the general reaction from people my age. To
Mhm.
be honest, I have a couple of thoughts on this. Number one, I don't think there's something inherently wrong with eating dogs as compared to any other animals that we traditionally eat. Pigs, horses in Central Asia is something that they eat. We eat beef, we eat chicken, right? We don't have a problem with eating these animals. We don't. There are arguments in favor of veganism and vegetarianism, and I acknowledge them. I actually agree with a lot of them. But the point I'm trying to make is most people don't follow veganism and vegetarianism. People eat chicken happily or pork or beef or whatever it may be, right? But no one has a problem with eating these animals, right? Unless it's like exceptions, like Muslims don't eat pork and whatnot, and Hindus don't eat beef. But, all these cultures eat some form of meat and they have no problem with it. But when it comes to dogs, right? People are horrified. And then the stuff that I hear is one, they're mistreated. I'm totally against that. if dogs are mistreated, I don't want any part of that industry. Just like if pigs are tortured or chickens are tortured or whatever, or
Yeah.
I don't want to, I'm not going to buy that meat if I have the choice. Um, so it's not mistreatment of animals because like if I am eating dog, like I don't want my dog to be mistreated. So that's not it. Then it's a problem of intelligence. Dogs are smart. Pigs are smarter. They're way smarter than dogs. We have no problem eating pigs. So I think that argument is out of the window. And then dogs are pets. Yes, people keep chickens, pigs, cows, and all these animals as pets all the time. The reason people don't typically keep these as pets is because most people are no longer farmers. But when a huge percentage of the population was, agrarian and whatnot, people kept these animals as pets all the time. Does not stop them from eating them. So I don't really buy the pet argument either. What I really think it is, and this is like the spicy part of my theory, Koreans are against eating dogs because of cultural shame. They are aware of the jokes that other countries make of Koreans, like, the stereotypes and the racist jokes, like, oh, you're from Korea, you eat dogs and whatnot.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot of shame from that, because uh, it's not common in, I guess, the West or honestly in many countries around the world to eat dogs, right?
Oh,
So it's seen as something that's backwards and barbaric. That's how it's viewed in the West.
oh,
And because Korea, yeah,
I fully agree.
yeah,
Again,
and because Korea
yeah,
like follows the West, right? Like it does hold like the West to a pedestal, right? They want to be accepted by the West and they don't want to be seen as barbaric. So I think one of the stronger reasons for them having this revulsion towards dog meat in the younger generations is because they don't want to be seen as barbaric and they don't want to be shamed by it.
yeah,
But the way I feel about it, why be ashamed of it? Like if something is a part of your culture, then you don't have to conform to like another part of the world, right? Like I'm not a cultural relativist in that like all cultural practices are good and bad, like the practice
mhm,
of satyagraha, which is like in India, like when they used to like brides used to be like they would commit suicide by walking into flames and whatnot if their husbands died. Like I don't, I'm
yeah,
not the all cultural practices are equally good. But Central Asia, like they eat horses. It's been a part of their culture for the longest time. I think it'd be a shame if they started to, become ashamed of that because we in the West, our reaction to eating horses, are you
yeah.
crazy?
It would be a shame because horse is very tasty.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I've never had dog before,
Yeah.
but you know, if it is a part of the culture, it's part of the culture. Like, don't twist yourself and bend yourself out of the way to make another culture happy. Because we're not doing it for Korea. Like, we in the West, we don't change the way that we live based on what Koreans will think of us. So it shouldn't be done any other way either. Like, I'm very proud of American culture. I don't want the Brits telling us what to do. I don't care what they want us to do. We are who we are.
Yeah.
Similarly, I think Koreans should, if they don't want to eat dog meat, fine, but they should do it for their own reasons and not because of the cultural shame aspect, which is what I'm sensing. That's my
Yeah.
take.
Yeah. This ought to be a whole different topic, but I do find it kind of I don't know the best way to put it, but interesting, I guess. You know, how because like dogs do have a difficult relationship with humans, but
Mhm.
most of the arguments are like superficial, like intelligence. Like pigs can honestly be smarter than dogs. You know, um, um, and then let's see. I'll pass on the story for this, but you know, I know people who've had pets as pigs, and
Mhm.
they were essentially treated the same as dogs and acted the same as dogs, just as a pig. So again, yeah, there's some uh, credence to veganism or the non-consumption of certain meats or all meats and such. Personally, you know, it's how the world works. People eat meat. This the
Right.
way it is.
I mean,
Yeah.
so what do you think? Like, that's just my theory. I haven't shared it with anyone before. It's just something I've noticed from like the last 2 years here. Like, what do you think? Valid, not valid?
Oh no, I I I think it's one of those cases where you can definitely point to clear Western influence.
Hmm.
Because like, without it, would people even really care? Like,
Hmm.
I know dogging is a thing in China, which is also going
Hmm.
away, but
Right.
that also because of influence from the West and just a general Westernization of the Chinese mindset, or is it
Maybe
just
partly.
part? Maybe. It's again, it's hard to judge, especially in a place like China. In Korea, it's very clear influence. In China,
Right.
it's just it's a lot more murky. But
Hmm.
yeah, again, this is kind of my one of my things, current things that I find fun to think about. Just to speculate on is yeah, like dog eating, suit wearing, you know, pop listening. I mean, like, if you think
Yeah.
of music, country is a purely American genre in music, and it has
Right.
bled into certain. I think even Korea has Korean country now.
I mean, so I guess like to wrap this up, like to let me ask you this. Is there any aspect of culture or influence that has worked in reverse? Like, have you noticed any trends? Like, I haven't been living in the States the last 2 years where recently, like, a foreign cultural aspect has sort of like influenced America, in reverse.
Oh, I mean, I know European ideals. Oh, that is kind of bled in. More is it global perspective versus national. I mean, I guess the go-to would be like Mexican kind of culture starting to bleed
Yeah,
into America. You can
right.
also argue Canadian as well. But and this is also kind of what's interesting with America is a melting pot. American culture is kind of a blend of different cultures and a standalone
Mhm.
of itself.
Mm,
Others are much more homogenous, and therefore
mm,
you can see influence more clearly. But
mm.
I think again, like the I'm trying to think like language changes have mainly just been English. It's also been English based. Um,
Right.
cultural. I'll have to think about it more. Again, like I know I have my biases. You have your own biases from your culture and raising,
Mhm.
family and all that. So I'll need to think about it some more. You know, see if there's anything that's not that I can't point to. Like, oh, you know, you know, oh, well, family, influence on this certain perspectives very clear those kind of stuff.
Right. I mean, in the short term, I think you kind of answered it nail on the head. I think the biggest cultural influence that America has, like if you had to pick one answer, Mexican cuisine. Like it is legitimately, I think in the States, man, like a cornerstone of our diet now, like taco nights, burritos, like everybody knows what like an enchilada
Yeah,
is, or like might grab like, go to Chipotle and like order a quesadilla. Um,
yeah.
is it as American as like American barbecue and ranch? Not quite, but it's like it's up there.
It is up there. But I'm trying to think of like, is there anything you kind of like point to of like Mexican culture on American, like again, changing American thinking in a
Cinco de
way?
Mayo, I mean, it's kind of celebrated in the US, but I
In
think
a
that's
way,
more of an excuse for people to drink.
yeah, yeah. Again, this is something that again, it's kind of why I say like the speculative thinking
Mm,
because this is the kind of because for the moment for it's not something like with the Maya, or is it prevalence of foods, even just Spanish speakers. But I'm thinking like in like hey like if you think of like Mexican ideals, yeah, like more, like familial, more, the kind of the spiritual aspects. I wonder
Mm.
if it's any. I'll need to look into if there's any influence on that. But
Honestly, like
interesting thought experiment. Looking
I
into it.
I think rather than one culture, we take bits and pieces of various cultures, like,
Yeah,
Mexican food. I know yoga is super popular with a lot of women. They're really into like the meditation and like the exercise benefits of that, and that's from India. Um, Chinese food, K drama, K pop is super
yeah,
popular. You and I grew up on, manga and anime, so Japan was always like the cool place. Like as kids, like
yeah,
everybody
yeah,
wanted to go to Japan.
yeah,
Everybody wanted to learn Japanese. It was cringe. So probably, but there wasn't one country. It was just like bits and pieces of like different cultures.
yeah. Like I said, it is very easy to see American influence on other countries.
Mm,
Um, yeah, again, even like the solar stuff, but yeah, obvious foreign influence on America is again plain to see. But again, like what I'm kind of interested in is seeing the change in thinking again. Like, well, yeah, let's say anime for example, and you know, I'm sure there's a change of thinking between people who read anime, watched anime, and people who
mm,
haven't. Just a different view on the world, on how they
yeah.
see things and how they can imagine it. Yeah, but maybe for later then.
Yeah. All right. That was a great episode. Let's do it again in the future, man.
Yeah.
Hello?